Hello again, everyone. The topic of today's lesson is going to be connecting ideas. Now, the topic or the title of today's lesson doesn't leave much room for imagination. The meaning should be pretty clear. Today we're going to be talking about how to link our ideas when we're speaking or when we are writing in a clear, cohesive manner. And it's very, very important that particularly when you are writing, you make effective use of linking words and connecting words in your writing to clearly establish your arguments and clearly conjoin your ideas for your audience. You should not expect your audience to connect the dots on their own. You should clearly connect the dots for them. And this will make your writing much clearer and much easier to understand and, as such, much better. So, to achieve this goal, to combine and to link our arguments and our ideas, we need to use a special kind of language to do this. And we call these either conjunctions, connectors, or linking words or expressions. Now, first, since we're looking at linking words, we should explain that linking words can be expressed in 1, 2, or 3 word phrases, or even longer. These can actually be full sentences sometimes. So let's start simply by looking at single words. Now, you probably have been introduced to words like firstly and secondly, and their cousins thirdly, fourthly, fifthly, finally. These, however, are the simplest, and they're quite boring. These are the words that you use when you have literally no other idea what you should say. And you can fall back on these, but it's much better to use something more interesting. Now, this rule does not apply for other one-word expressions like however, furthermore, or nevertheless. These are completely fine to use. And I actually highly recommend using phrases like furthermore and nevertheless to develop an argument. Now, for 2 or 3 word phrases, we can use phrases like for example or for instance in order to provide examples or to provide situations where our argument may apply. Likewise, we can also use phrases like for this reason. This we also use when we're giving motivations or reasons for something. It's pretty self-explanatory. Now, another phrase that will be quite useful and sounds quite good is to exemplify this. Now, exemplify may sound like a scary word, but don't be frightened by it. This is basically the same phrase as for example, but when you exemplify something, you make the perfect example. If something is, or if something exemplifies something else, or it's exemplary of something else, it's the perfect one. For example, to exemplify this topic, you should look at the essay provided in any of your lessons. Here, it's a perfect example, we hope, of how to write. Now, you can also use phrases like first of all, or we use this phrase when we're discussing series or a long list of things. It's kind of like firstly, but a little more interesting. Or as a result. Now this we used to discuss consequence. I could also say in consequence. And finally, in contrast, to show difference. Or in fact, to provide more information. Now, moving on to longer phrases, there are a few of these that you may have already been introduced to before. For example, on one hand and on the other hand. Now, another example that's quite longer than normal is by way of contrast. This is another way of saying in contrast. It's another way of showing that things are different. Now, another phrase that we can use is a little bit longer, but again, don't be concerned. We can say the next issue that needs to be considered or highlighted is. This is a very, very good way of moving between paragraphs. And this is another one that I highly recommend using because it's quite common and it sounds quite good. Another phrase that we can use is an illustration of this is. Now, what's an illustration? It's a picture. So if I'm saying a picture of this is, it's another way of saying for example. Now, you can also say an illustration of this would be. And the difference is, if I'm saying would be instead of saying is that would be creates a hypothetical situation or an unreal situation. It's when I'm just presenting an idea which may or may not be real, but would prove my argument. And a few more phrases we can use to cut a long story short when we're concluding, and also to put it into a nutshell. Both of these are a little bit informal, and they can be used in more informal situations. In a formal essay or informal writing, I would avoid both of these. And finally, there are some full sentences that we may use to transition between arguments and between ideas. Now, feel free to simply copy and paste these sentences into your writing. It's completely fine. These are sentences that native speakers and writers use all the time, so it will sound normal. And these are sentences like, there are two opposing points of view on this. Or, another issue worth considering is, or another important issue is worth considering. And finally, at this stage, one further issue must be dealt with. Now, all of these are very effective transitions between paragraphs. I would not use these sentences in the middle of a long paragraph. I would usually begin a new paragraph with these sentences. Now, today we're also going to talk about linking words according to their meaning. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Now, let's start by discussing phrases which express addition. And in these sentences, we're simply adding more info or elaborating more on our previous arguments. And to do this, we can use phrases like also, both, as well, not only, but, besides, in addition to, additionally, furthermore, what's more, similarly, and moreover. Now, before I explain further, I want to mention two things. One, what is more is informal. So remember that. You should not use what is more in formal writing. You should stick with something like furthermore. And avoid using the word also if you can, simply because it's very overused and it's very boring. It's much better to use an alternative word. So let's look at the following two sentences now and examine how exactly we can use these. I can say, the book Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie is adventurous. It is easy to read, too. But here I've used two sentences, and that's a little bit awkward. It would be much more fluent and much more natural and much more concise to express this as one sentence. So I can do this in a few different ways. I can say, the book Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie is both adventurous and easy to read. Or, the book Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie is adventurous and easy to read as well. Or I can say, the book Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie is adventurous as well as easy to read. Or even, the book Peter Pan is not only adventurous, but also easy to read. And finally, I can change my sentence structure entirely. And I can say, besides being adventurous, the book is also easy to read. Those aren't the only phrases though, right? We had in addition to, additionally, so let's look at a few more of these. Now, these we're going to use when we're conjoining separate sentences which have very similar ideas. So in the others, I was turning two simple sentences into one more complex, more concise sentence. Here, I'm going to be explaining two more complicated ideas, so I need to keep them as two sentences. I can't combine them easily. So here, we're going to be practicing using a different set of connecting words and, well, linking words. So, I could say something like, jogging helps keep us fit. Moreover, it makes you feel livelier. Here, I've kept it as two separate sentences because I really want to emphasize both points, and because they're two more complex ideas. Next, being a doctor takes much responsibility. Furthermore, you cannot afford a mistake in this job. Here, again, I'm providing much more detail to you. So I should keep these as two separate sentences. Now, when writing, we also may need to introduce ideas or examples. So when we're introducing an idea, we may use words like first, or first of all, or to start with, to begin with, or in the first place. All of these are used with about the same frequency, but again, avoid things like first, simply because it's boring. And you should also note that we typically don't say things like in the second place or in the third place. Only in the first place. If you say in the second place, it will sound a little bit strange. Now, for introducing examples, we'll also commonly use phrases like, for example, for instance. To exemplify this, which we discussed earlier, an illustration of this is, or a further example is. Now, all of these, again, can be used with about the same level of frequency. So feel free to change between which one you use as you wish. Now, to express contrast, we can also use the following words and expressions to show that things are different. For example, I can say, but, yet, however, nevertheless, in fact, although, even though, simply though, in spite of, followed by a noun or a gerund, in spite of the fact that, despite, whereas, while, and on one hand and on the other hand. But there are a few things that I want to bring your attention to with these phrases. One is that you should not start a sentence with but. You may start a sentence with any of the other expressions, just not but. And it's just one of those rules in English that you should remember. Now, I'd like to bring your attention to the fact as well that we cannot use in spite of and despite with a that clause. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's look at a couple examples. First, in spite of the rainy weather, or despite rainy weather, we went for a walk. Or in spite of being tired, and despite being tired, she continued working on the report. Now here, I didn't use that for either sentence. Now, there's something though that we should kind of admit with this, and it's a little complicated. So here, if I say in spite of or despite, I can't use that. But we have another expression, despite the fact that, or in spite of the fact that. And in both of these expressions, we must use that. Well, it's not really must, but everyone always uses that in these cases. It will sound very strange if you don't. So, for example, I can say, we went for a walk despite the fact that it was raining. Or despite the fact that she was tired, or in spite of the fact that she was tired, she kept working on the report. And here both of these are completely correct. Now, other phrases that we should remember are phrases like even though. And even though is a stronger form of the phrase although. For example, you keep listening to loud music even though I've asked you to turn it down twice. It's stronger. It has a little bit of a stronger feeling and a stronger meaning to it. And to link two ideas that contrast with each other, we will often use phrases like while or whereas. For example, we always want to go to the seaside, while or whereas the children prefer to go climbing. Here, these are linking contrasting ideas. They're linking ideas that are, in fact, different. And finally, to show that there can be multiple sides of an argument, or to show that there are, in fact, two sides to an argument, we will use the expressions on one hand and on the other hand, just like in this example. On one hand, my mom has always wanted to live in the countryside and work in a big city. On the other hand, she's never wanted to spend much time on the way to work. Here, I'm simply showing that there are two sides and that they really contrast. Now, we also may need to explain the order of our ideas or elaborate the order of our ideas during our writing. And to do this, we can use phrases like firstly, secondly, thirdly, lastly, finally, next, at the same time, beforehand, eventually, prior to that, and the next issue that needs to be considered is. Now, logically, these will also appear in numeric order. If you start with firstly, then you'll move on to secondly. It's pretty logical, I think. There's not much to explain here. Now, we may often need to use linking words which express cause or reason for an event or an action. And to do this, we can use the following phrases. First, due to, or because of, owing to the fact that, on account of. Now, we should mention though here that there's one important rule, and it's that you should not start a sentence with because if you're writing. It's not really formally correct. When people are speaking, they may do it, and it's generally accepted if you're speaking. But when you're writing, you should avoid it. And let's look at some examples of these. First, new laws have been adopted to stop plants and factories polluting the water and atmosphere because, as, or since pollution is damaging to our environment. Or I could also restructure my sentence and say, due to the fact that, or owing to the fact that pollution is damaging our environment, new laws have been adopted. Now, I may also need to express result as well. So to express result, we often use phrases like so and that, or such and that. Remember, so is used with an adjective and such is used with a noun. For example, so beautiful that, or such a good teacher that. Next, phrases like as a result, or consequently, therefore, or thus. Thus is very kind of formal, and it's part of very formal English, but I've always been a fan of including it in my academic writing, if only because it's not common. And it's kind of eye-catching. It's kind of interesting when you see it, so don't be afraid of it, even though it sounds a bit formal. It's good for academic usage. So let's look at some examples of these. Again, he is such a good teacher that students crowd his classroom. Here, such followed by a noun, such a teacher. Good here does not matter for the grammar. And another example, Jake spent most of his time hanging around with his friends. Consequently, therefore, or as a result, he had lots of difficulties while passing the exam. Now, the series of events or ideas presented is very, very important in each and every kind of writing activity. At the end of every story, there should be a kind of logical conclusion, and to introduce our conclusion, we also have sets of linking words and expressions. For example, finally, to conclude, to draw a conclusion, in conclusion, and better, more formal phrases like, from all of the evidence given above, it is clear, as well as some informal phrases like, to cut a long story short, or to put it into a nutshell. And these last two I would avoid in very, very formal writing. You can use them in school essays generally, and you can use them in more informal, like articles, for example, or informal essays, but in formal writing they should be avoided. Now, that's about it for the main group of linking words and of conjunctions, connecting phrases, all of it. Now, be sure when you are writing and when you are planning your essays that you use a logical order and a logical series of conjunctions and linking words in your essays to make them more clear. Basically, arrange your essays in a logical format in a way that's easy to read and makes sense. You will find a list of useful linking words in the files which accompany this lesson. And I would also like to give you one final rule that you can use before we end, and that is this. Try not to repeat any linking words or conjunctions in the same paragraph, or really in every other paragraph. So for example, if I say however in paragraph A, I should try not to use it again until paragraph C. And this is a good rule that will help you develop that diverse, varied vocabulary which you can use, which will really make your writing more outstanding. So that's about it for today. Remember to review this lesson and remember to practice not just saying with and not just using simpler linking words like also and but to practice using the more interesting, more varied, more dynamic vocabulary which we've presented for you. So review and practice, and